Thank you for listening in with me at Seeking Eye. A little bit about myself. My name is Darren, and I use the surname Mac online just for simplicity's sake because my full surname is much more difficult to remember. I established the Seeking Eye project to research the nature of life, death, and beyond. I have since set up events, interviews, and debates with some of the leading thinkers and researchers on the subjects, the results of which I share freely as discussions or podcast episodes on the Seeking Eye YouTube channel and Podbean profile. Until now, I have funded this project myself, but as the costs of producing and publishing my work have risen, I'm now reaching out for support via DonorBox and Patreon. If you support Seeking Eye monthly through Patreon, you will receive certain rewards depending on which tier you sign up for. You can donate to the project via buttons which you will find online at seeking-eye.com. You can also find the links to both of these in the description beneath each YouTube video and Podbean podcast episode. Of course, there is no obligation, but all donations will be gratefully received and used exclusively to improve this project. Thank you very much.
I opened my private practice in 1999 and trained with Dr. Alan Botkin in 2006, and it was such a revolutionary thing. That's pretty much grief and loss and trauma has been my focus ever since then, and this is really the best tool that I have found since I started practicing back in 1983. So it's just really taken over.
So IADC is induced after-death communication, isn't it?
That's right.
I believe it's a derivative of REBT, which is rapid eye...
EMDR. Eye movement desensitization.
I don't know what REBT is.
Yeah, we've got all sorts of acronyms floating around. But.
So eye movement desensitization therapy, isn't it?
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing is the full name. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, could you describe kind of how that works and how that develops into IADC, and then kind of what the experience is of that?
Yeah. Well, eye movement therapy has been around since the early '90s, I think, and it was kind of an accidental discovery, which IADC was too, but. The brief explanation is that when there is a traumatic experience, and certainly grief qualifies for that, there's a pathway that gets encoded into the brain. The first sensory input comes in and hits the emotional center, the amygdala, basically, and it kind of teams up with the hypothalamus, which is very you're not going to form any memory without a hypothalamus involved, but that first loop gets kind of stuck. We know that when there's something traumatic, adrenaline is involved, and we know from PET scans and things like that adrenaline actually starts shunting blood flow away from your prefrontal cortex. It says you don't need to think, you just need to run, jump, get out of the way, hide, do something. So you don't get a chance to really process what's happened to you before the memory is formed. So every time you come back to that memory, all that happens is you get this emotional playback loop, which triggers more panic or more distancing sometimes. And what we found is that the simple bilateral stimulation that was originally done, with eye movements, while you're focused on that trauma, that memory, it usually plugs back in your cognitive ability. So you're actually seeing this memory from a different perspective than the feedback loop you've been
Right.
stuck with.
So you're kind of overriding the kind of the conditioned response.
You actually form a new memory. It's the memory of a whole brain perspective as opposed to an emotional brain perspective. And that's how Botkin was working for 20 years with VA, Veterans Administration, clientele, people who had been through the Vietnam War mainly.
Yeah.
And, up until EMDR came along, he was doing what they call desensitization therapy, which is you tell the same story over and 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 over. And it's very tedious and it's very painful.
The idea being that over time you become numb to it, I suppose.
Yeah, that you have this long exposure to it. But he said he discovered and was trained in EMDR, and he said it was kind of the difference between pushing your car around town and suddenly getting an engine put in it. That it just accelerated everything. And EMDR has a specific, very buttoned up protocol for it. It's like 8 steps involved in doing EMDR therapy. And it's a great technique. And I've trained in EMDR, and I'm very willing to say it's just terrific. What Botkin discovered was that in just taking a few little steps out, like telling people to find a safe place, and when things would get too rough, you could kind of move back off to this safe place and go away from the impetus that's making you afraid or anxious. A couple of other little steps. He was getting people there even faster in terms of, and most of these people that he was working with, not only had they experienced the trauma of war, but the personal loss of fellow soldiers and people that they knew in that war zone. And when he got them to this particular place, and Aaron, we're talking minutes, tens of minutes, not days, not weeks. When you go from a level of distress that you rate as the very top that you could possibly experience, and then you get to the level of, say, almost nothing, and you do that within 20, 30 minutes, that's a therapist's dream right there. But what he discovered quite accidentally was that when people got to that point and they were thinking about the loss of that person, they were re-experiencing that person in real time in his office. And he first, thought the first guy that did that was, latent schizophrenia or something. But it kept happening over, all his clients and all of the, the years that he kept doing that. And then he started training other therapists to do that in the VA, and they had the same experience. And then he finally left the VA and went public with it. And we've, tracked that for the last, 16, 17 years. And that phenomenon continues to happen at a rate of about 75 to 80%.
Of that very speedy recovery through this technique.
Well, and what I mean by the 75, 80% is that 75, 80% of the people that have the treatment have an experience or re-experience or reconnection with the person they lost. That's one of the things I really enjoy about this, is that even the people that don't, and for me that's been very few, have that experience. What they do leave with is this sudden and amazing reduction in the distress that they're walking around with.
So even if they don't have this experience, it seems a lot more effective than standard EMDR by itself.
I think it's more efficient. I don't know that it's any more effective, but it, compared to other methods that I have been exposed to and tried as far as traumatic experiences or certainly grief, it's just really amazingly good.
So, of course, the fundamental question then regarding induced after-death communications is are these people really seeing these deceased people or really communicating with them, or is it simply a hypnotic kind of, not hallucination, but a hypnotic kind of state that they're in, and it's bringing their images from their own mind?
It's certainly, and that's the nice part of it. I mean, you can walk into a session and just be, a very convinced atheist and say, that's not possible, so that's not going to happen. And even if it happens, I'm not going to believe it. You still have the experience. And then you do, like any other experience you have, you get to do with it what you want. And there was an aborted documentary that was made a long time ago with Dr. Botkin. I think it's called Healing After the War. And I think you can still find the trailer for it on YouTube or something. And one of the veterans that they interviewed said, people have asked me, was that real? And I tell them, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. When you experience it, it works. And I'm very happy with that. And personally said, yeah, I think there's a piece of your brain that's wired up to heal you. And we found it. And so that's been Botkin's answer for years and years. I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's like any other experience you have. You have to make meaning out of that. And my personal experiences prevent me from absolutely being on board with that, because I've had too many after-death communications that were real, meaningful, and spontaneous. And
for you personally?
Me personally, yes. In fact, that's how I set up my practice to begin with, was that after many years, first as a pastoral minister and then as a psychotherapist, what I noticed was that when people would come in for almost all of their distressing problems, that the majority of them included or were, induced by unfinished business with people that weren't there. I said, that's just kind of a given, that first of all, we don't grieve well, we don't grieve completely, and there's just a lot of fallout from that. So when I met my wife, and one of the first things, I think it was our first date actually, she said, "Graham, I need to tell you something." And I went, "Oh geez, what's this going to be? I'm hung up on my ex-husband, or I only vote Republican, or
yeah.
I love country western music, or some deal breaker like that for me." And she said, "No, dead people talk to me." And I went, "Oh, well, at least it wasn't those first three things, so I guess we're home free here, She is a world-class medium. She is astoundingly good. Um, it was on our third date that I brought a book with me to see her. She picked it up and said, "This isn't your book." And I said, "Well, it was given to me by a friend." He said, "Is your friend dead?" "Yes." "Did he shoot himself in the head?" "Yes." "Was he left-handed?" "Yes." "Was his name Don?" "Yes." "Was he married to Barbara?" "Yes." "Well, he says there was another note that she didn't find, and he wants you to call her and tell her where to find the second note." And I did, and she did. And in basically those 30 seconds, the world changes.
Yeah, I can imagine it.
You don't, but when I set up my practice after we got married, I said, it would be really nice. I was trained as a family systems therapist. That was my major,
area of focus.
thrust.
Yeah.
And I said, one of the early pioneers in the family therapy world would not see you as an individual unless you brought 3 generations of your family with you, because he felt that was the only way to know who you really were. And that, which is pretty inconvenient, and insurance really doesn't like doing that much.
Yeah.
But in most cases, when you're dealing with adults, there's a lot of people who aren't going to be physically available. So I asked her if she would join me and be a consultant with a lot of these cases, for a lot of the unfinished business, a lot of the abuse, a lot of the not just grief, but the remnants of some terrible family interactions that are hanging around. And she did.
So she brings through the deceased past family members, I see.
Exactly.
Because they can't physically be there.
Yeah. And so we did that for about 7 years, and then IADC came along, and so we did some experimenting. Once we did that, I had one IADC client. All my wife knew was that I was seeing someone. Didn't say male or female or anyone. I was up in the office at this particular time, and she said, "Well, I'm going to do a blind reading for this person." And so, I taped that session. She taped her session. We came home and cross-checked each other. She knew my client was female. She knew that her husband had died. She knew that the husband had died in bed with her at night. She did not know that it was related to a diabetic crisis, but that his basically he died from suffocation. That was the mechanism. But we knew at the same time the same information when she was not in the room and was not privy to the counseling session, which if we needed a cherry on the sundae, I think that might have been
it. It's certainly very interesting to hear cases like this that are so spontaneous and so kind of verified. I mean, I remember you mentioned in the email about the first case with your friend Don who passed.
Yeah.
And you said to me that there was no kind of going through various names, like the television mediums do. I'm sensing a name beginning with the letter F or a C.
Yeah.
It was, as you say, it was straight one after another with no hesitation. Is he dead?
Bang, 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 bang.
Yeah.
Just
fact after fact after fact that.
Yeah.
you can't really chalk to coincidence, because a name like Don, shot in the head,
Yeah.
wife's name. I mean, left-handed. That's not
Yeah.
really something that you can talk away as cold reading, as many people try to do.
I've seen people try to do a cold reading, and this isn't anything like what she does.
No, I mean, I've seen cold reading for myself, firsthand. I went to a medium, and she was saying, I sense that your grandmother's died. And I said, yes. I mean, I was probably 23, 22 at the time. Chances were pretty high. And I said, yes, my grandmother. She said she liked to bake and she had knobbly knuckles. And I said, no, she didn't like to bake. But yeah, she did have knobbly knuckles. That kind of description is everybody's grandmother, really.
Yeah, sure.
And that was a very good example of cold reading, and you can often see when it's happening, especially with the television mediums with large audiences. They've got a very vast audience to pick from, so chances are anything generally that you're going to give out is going to be a hit with someone.
Yeah.
As in your example, when it's one-to-one and it's instant fact after fact after fact with no miss, that's when you start to, especially obscure things like the name of his wife and his name, things like that. That's the sort of thing that I take more seriously, and that I think everybody should.
She did a group reading once, actually did a number of them, but this one I remember the most. We had an old car that was kind of, it was beat up. It had smoking problems from probably loose piston rings and stuff. And what we found was that there was a government agency here in North Texas that would help us repair the thing with, I think, a very substantial monetary. They wanted to clean up the air in our cities, and it was called the North Texas Clean Air Association. And I think they gave us like $700 to get our car repaired so that it wasn't polluting the air as much. And the night she did the group reading, she said, and I had never heard of this group, this is a very specialized thing that we looked into.
You wouldn't know unless you needed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she says, who here has been to the North Texas Clean Air Association? And I went, oh my God, this is the most esoteric thing you could come out with, And this guy raises his hand just immediately. And he says, you had a sun pass? Yes. It was very sudden? Yes. Was it suicide? Yes. Just, stuff that just seemed rather obscure and almost random, but this is how they got it. By the way, speaking of things that came out, your name is Darren.
It is.
Before we were married, we were sitting one evening watching television, and she just suddenly turns to me and says, Graham, who is Darren? And I said, Darren was a little boy who died. I was the pastor of the church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And my son, who was very young at the time, and he was 2, and we had a little girl in the church that was taking care, watching children in the afternoons. Darren was one of the kids that was playing in that house, and my son was there, his brother was there, and Julie was doing, just having a wonderful time with him. She was balancing on her, she was lying on her back, balancing them on her feet and kind of launching them off, and they just loved that. And Darren lost his balance, fell over, hit his head on the hearth. And he was brain dead within 24 hours. And it was really the first child that I had ever done a funeral service for. And so I said, well, that's who Darren is. And he said, well, Darren's here, and he says he wants to thank you for taking care of his mother. And in subsequent sessions, she said that Darren was the guide who would bring children to their parents when she was having readings with them. That he was kind of a doorkeeper. But yeah, that's kind of that kind of makes the world a different place. Something like that happens.
Absolutely. And it's something that when it happens to you, especially being married to somebody who can do this, there's no escape from it. And I'm sure it would turn any non-believer into not a believer, but somebody that can't escape the facts that's before them.
Yeah, I mean, I was always kind of the bent that the universe was a place that that actually did have regard for individuals, and that this was not a cold and soulless existence that we lived. But I was not. There's nothing in my experience that said, this stuff is absolutely going on all around you. And, certainly our civilization does not seem to thrive on that information. and most of it is going to kind of push it in the other direction.
I mean, if you dare mention anything like this, especially online, hordes of people are there to tell you you're insane.
Yes. Oh, you're loony is the nice word that they will use.
Yeah,
but
certainly. Getting back to, obviously, I'm assuming that because of your experiences with that sort of thing, that you believe IADC is a genuine kind of connection with.
I do. Do you remember the last Harry Potter movie?
Yeah. Where
Harry has the scene with Dumbledore in the train station, and they're doing really important work, and then as Harry's leaving, he says, "Dumbledore, is this real or is this all in my head?" And Dumbledore has the most wonderful answer. He said, "Well, of course it's in your head, Harry, but why would you think it's not real?"
It's a good quote.
That's
another good one from J.K. Rowling is from the first book, isn't it? To the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure, or something like that.
Yeah. There's so many ways you can think about not being physically alive, and you could get really esoterically into physics and say, well, dead people are just individuals who don't participate in the Higgs boson stuff anymore. They've gone on beyond that.
Yeah.
But there's and how many dimensions of reality are there? Well, physicists will tell you at least 11. And things that you cannot see and you can't point to, but have to be that way. That's kind of the way this is for me. Things point there.
Yeah. Either your room's quite dusty, or I just saw an orb floating up above by the side of your head. Just
I'm
thing I
not sure. Yeah, dust would not be an impossibility here for sure.
So, as a psychologist yourself or a therapist, how do you approach the ideas that that these are simply conjurations from the mind of past memories of the people, as opposed to actual communications?
Like I said earlier, I don't I don't have the right to interpret somebody else's experience. That's what that autonomy is about. And uh, what I always think therapy is in the larger sense is, most of the distress that we come into is because we live in a very cramped reality, that needs to be enlarged. And, that may come from, some perfectionistic neurosis or something like that. Might come from all sorts of places, but the world you live in is too cramped, and it's biting you. It's sticking you in places that you can't thrive. And so that's what therapy is really all about. In most cases, I mean, only 15% of the people that come into a therapist's office really have a brain problem, something like, a bipolar disorder or a schizoaffective disorder or something like that, which, is all about metabolism. It's about not having enough dopamine or having too much dopamine or something like that, that I can't fix. I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have a license to prescribe stuff, but fortunately, most of the people that are having problems don't need that,
most of them are purely kind of circumstantial, caused by stress or situations.
Or habitual response to particular part of the world. One of the things that I've always noticed is that people, everybody has a particular strength in their approach to the world. This really works well in that situation. I may be driven, to persevere, but our biggest weakness is usually an overdone strength. That's we're trying to use, we know how to use a hammer, and we're going to use a hammer on everything, including screws, and that doesn't work very well. You have to learn new techniques, new abilities. You can't just use the same one over and over and over on everything.
No, you need to identify what kind of trait fits what circumstance.
Exactly.
And I think people, as you say, get so caught up on one strength that they end up believing that's their only strength. And that's
all I got. You take it away from me and I'm screwed,
Yeah.
And that can be really tricky in some therapeutic situations where people have learned, let's say they had an abusive childhood, and they learn to dissociate. They learn to, I see that thing. Yeah. I just saw it.
That looked like dust or a hair or something.
Well, hair is certainly a possibility with my COVID haircut, but
I've just got my regular haircut, which is just the same.
Yeah, I haven't had one since January, but dissociation is very adaptive in a childhood situation that you can't escape from. You can't overpower the oppressor. You can't get out of there. Can't go live by yourself. But when that becomes your go-to method for dealing with stress, and you're an adult, then you got a problem,
Yeah, because you never learn anything.
And trying to convince your unconscious to give up something that's helped you survive is a real difficulty. So, are you crazy? No, we're not doing that.
Yeah, your kind of your body and your mind puts up resistance to any other kind of idea. So to reinforce that core belief or that core, technique. So do you find in your professional practice that many therapists take this IAND,
IDC?
too many acronyms. Do they take this kind of process seriously as therapy?
it is a real stumbling block for a lot of people. I remember going to an EMDR training, and it was my second one. And between sessions, we were talking, and this nice lady, asked me and said, "Well, what are you doing? What do you specialize in?" And I told her about IADC, and she just froze, just stared at me like, I had said, "Yes, and I have a second head on my back. Would you like to see it?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Is this some kind of
voodoo thing?
Narrative therapy that you're doing? Is this some kind of fantasy therapy that you're?" "No, ma'am. This is something that happens spontaneously." "Well, do you hypnotize people?" I know how to do that, but this is not what I'm doing. We don't ask people to relax. We ask people to lean into the sadness. Mm-hmm. And she just kind of backed off from me and slipped away, and I've had clients that, are finally driven to make the call and talk to me and said, "Well, I talked to another therapist about this, and they said that is ridiculous." But again, that's the unproven assumption that consciousness is a product of the brain, that there's no possibility of that. Mm. And I say it's unproven because there is no proof. We don't know where consciousness comes from.
No.
It's
not even just a matter of proof. In science, proof isn't really the aim. It's just that the evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that the brain produces consciousness solely. There are other possibilities. And in my opinion, every piece of evidence you can bring up for the brain creating consciousness, you can also use equally or even more parsimoniously with the idea that the brain receives or filters consciousness.
Absolutely. It's, I think it's the best analogy, I think, is that it's some kind of venturi that, focuses consciousness into a particular place at a particular time. I remember when really good video games first hit the home market, I invested in this jet fighter simulation, and I was really hooked on that for a while, and I got in my F4 Phantom, and I was trying to outduel this MiG-21, and I was twisting and turning all over the place, and I kind of lost track of my altitude. And then at one point I noticed right away I'm going 900 miles an hour and I'm 40 feet off the ground.
I've done that
and
in simulators.
I was really quite shocked when the screen turned black why I wasn't feeling intense deceleration trauma.
Yeah.
Because I had invested that interface, with reality.
Was it like just a monitor and a joystick, or was it kind of one of those booths?
Yeah, it was a monitor and a joystick, and
your attention was so focused in that moment that.
Yeah, I was not sitting in that chair as far as I was concerned. I was, up in the sky with this deadly duel going on, And I thought, what if, what I experience every day when I wake up is, kind of like that. I'm turning on the monitor, and this thing I call a body is kind of my interface with this simulated situation.
There are so many theories of consciousness, so many kind of viewpoints. You've got, as you say, the simulation theory that we're all in a simulated environment, simulated by someone else. You've got idealism, which says that everything is mind and consciousness, not that there's matter and consciousness, but it's all one aspect of one thing. You've got idealism, which says that everything's conscious. I'm not exactly sure on the differences, and then you've got materialism. people think materialism, the brain producing consciousness as being part of that, is already the case. I think it's only until you really look into it do you realise there are these other areas that are just as plausible, if not more so, in my opinion. Although a lot more people will defend materialism other than defending these others.
Yeah, and I think that's, kind of a product of our economic civilization. If there's something more to you than I can use in my production of goods and services and wealth, then I'm really not interested right now.
Yeah. And I mean, the materialistic philosophy has done absolutely amazing things over the past several hundred years. Everything that we can attribute to discovery, to technology, is all based on materialism, which of course science initially was. But that's not to say that we can therefore say that everything is bound by those laws.
Exactly. And as great as an advancement that has been, it's like saying we cleaned up. There's a way of cleaning your home that says start in one corner and work outward. And I think that's kind of what we've been up to. We worked in one corner of existence and done a pretty good job for hundreds of years now.
Absolutely.
But whether that has produced more happiness or existential joy is kind of up in the air.
It's certainly, we need as a species to be more open to different ideas, because I mean there are people, as I say, that will defend materialism to the hill and will insult and ridicule anybody that disagrees. But there are also people on the other side that say materialism is completely nonsense. If you believe in it, you're a sheep. I hear that a lot. And I think to people, here you go. Thanks, materialism and physical science, because you've got one of these. And to take away everything that materialism has ever given you, and you'd have nothing. So to say it's useless and to ridicule people for believing in that is ridiculous. But then equally to say,
I'm very happy with I have had 2 surgeries on 2 broken Achilles tendons and a repair of my shoulder. And I'm thinking, if I was in the 15th century, I'd be sitting by the side of the road with a bowl. That was all that would be left to me.
And of course, if we were born, as you say, before the time of medicine and everything else, we'd be having someone praying over us for that, or burning herbs to the gods.
Or bleeding me or something.
Yeah, exactly. So certainly the materialistic viewpoint has been incredibly important, but that's not to say we've got a very clean corner of that house, and it's getting cleaner. Yeah, and the methodologies, unfortunately, due to their nature, the methodologies are only able to progress that certain viewpoint. So it's time, we need to develop other means of investigating things that may not be physical, as you say, experiences of mediumship or of IADCs seem to suggest that there may be this other dimension to existence. I'm really looking, I'm not looking for it in my lifetime, but I'm really looking for the interface between materialism and non-materialism, and because it's at some point, they obviously do intersect. Just like Einstein's general relativity intersects with quantum theory somewhere. We still haven't quite got that yet, but obviously it exists. Macro becomes micro and vice versa somehow. I think the only thing that's stopping that congruence, if that's the right word, of materialism and more spiritual matters is that people, especially the scientists, are afraid that once that happens, it will completely override or remove all the work that's ever been done, everything we've ever found in the past, because they think it will no longer apply. If we prove somehow that consciousness is not a product of the brain, they think therefore all neuroscience, all of physical matter, everything we know about it will no longer be usable, be redundant. And unfortunately, that's how people see it, but that's not the case. It's not a case of overriding a current paradigm. It's adding on to it, adding these extra layers.
It's part of the scientific method that, things that were scientifically proven a while back aren't anymore, and you've got something else that works better. But to fear that is, I think it was 1896 that there was actually a bill brought forth in the United States Congress that said, we want to close the patent office because everything that's useful to be invented has already been invented.
Yeah.
How myopic can you possibly be?
But and what happened? Planes, technology, all sorts of
just
things.
The whole 20th century,
Exactly. And I think, to think that sort of thing even now, that we understand a percentage of what reality is constructed of, what constitutes reality, is ridiculous. I'm sure in another 100, 200 years, even that short a time, we'll be looking back and laughing at what we think is correct now.
Oh, sure. I don't know if you're familiar with one of Woody Allen's early movies called Sleeper, and it's kind of a Rip Van Winkle movie where he gets inadvertently frozen, and he comes back to consciousness 100 years later, and he's run a vitamin and health food store before he went into storage, and so that's what he asks for when he wakes up is some of these health foods, and the guy stands around scratching his head and says, oh my God, were there no chocolate pies? Were there no candy stores when you went to sleep?
Yeah.
we know all those stuff's good for us now.
Yeah.
It's really making fun of that whole idea that we know what we know, and it's really the gospel truth.
Yeah, and even in terms of science itself, the methodology that we take as the best now, like empiricism, repeatable, testable, predictable hypotheses, and things like that, they work. We know they work, but to think that they are the only means of gathering useful information about the way the world works, science is a process of development, and there are phenomena that seem to challenge that method now, because that method cannot tell us why near-death experiences take place when the brain's flatline. It cannot tell us how mediums can pick up verifiable information. All we can say is that doesn't happen because our methods don't cover it. So instead of looking at the phenomena, maybe we should look at the methods and try and develop.
That's a very good thought. That's a very good thought, Darren. That the method, I forget who said this, but words themselves limit our reality, what we can even think. And if there's a certain construct of wording that says this is how we're going to conceive of things, that may be that may be the fishbowl that we're living in, and not even know it.
Yes, I mean, as soon as you go into the realms of experience, of subjective experience, as soon as someone tries to describe that, it's straight away it's going through your filters and it's being comprehended in your own way. So being able to really tell an experience in its total experience to somebody else is an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially when we start getting to the transpersonal levels of existing as oneness or existing in timelessness, where the words, even just to portray that experience, haven't been invented.
No, we don't know how to refer to that
exactly,
except analogously and obliquely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the problem is when we rely on the method of discovery we've got, how can you empirically test these subjective experiences outside of anecdotal data, which is is a curse word in science a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
At least those that don't really understand what the difference between anecdotal data and widespread thousands and millions of accounts data.
But when I think about that, what I'm kind of left with is that most of the scientific data that I accept, I have not proven for myself. as far as I'm concerned, this is anecdotal from somebody else, you know. And you know, I'm always kind of thrown back when I think of, you know, Carl Sagan saying extraordinary claims require extraordinary truths or extraordinary proofs. I'm thinking, how extraordinary is it that we discount the near-death experiences of almost 1 billion people that are alive today? You know, what would you have to, you know, what proof would you have that 1 billion people are just fucking lying to you?
Yeah.
You know, that just makes me sick.
And one thing that annoys me is when people say near-death experiences aren't evidence because they're anecdotal. And anecdotal data is, you know, I had this experience, therefore I believe every experience is like this. That's based on one anecdote. You know, when you've got millions, you know, they think 20, or an estimate is up to 20%, isn't it, of the population have had these experiences, which is, as you say, 1 billion people. That's you know. Yeah, and including those that are third-party verified perceptions.
Yes.
That, to me, takes it well beyond the range of what can be reasonably called anecdotal.
If it's 3 people in Iowa, then I may, you know, say I'm going to pass on that. But you know, when it's all over the world and in every culture, whether it's advanced or third world or even primitive, you know, you got the same elements.
Yeah.
Now that just doesn't, that strains any kind of credulity that says, you know, oh, this is just all made up. Or
and I mean there are differences in the cultural experiences of it.
There are. But
as you say, the core foundations seem the same. It's the way they're interpreted. I mean, for example, it seems that in Asian culture there's no life review, whereas that's a big part
exactly. Yeah.
Which is curious, although we wonder if there is a life review, but it's experienced in a different way. And I think Bruce Grayson has done this. I don't know exactly the details of whether there is or not a life review in a different form, but I'm due to have a chat with him, so that's a question I need to ask him.
Oh, with Dr. Grayson?
Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, I did a talk for Ions a few years back.
I saw.
Oh, you saw that?
I saw.
And he was there, so I got to meet him. He was he's very interesting fellow.
Do you find that, have you ever had somebody who's come in, say, who is strictly a materialist or strictly doesn't believe in anything other than what's here? You know, when your brain dies, you dies, who have had a session of IADC and have changed their mind as a result?
I personally have not. I have not had anybody, you know. Now, I have had people come up to me after some of the sessions my wife has had and said, you know, that changed my life. And I said, funny you should say that, you know, me too. But that's one of the problems, I think, with IADC is that the name will scare off a lot of people, you know.
Yeah, I don't they'd be quite freaked out by the thought.
Yeah, it's like, I'm not going to go do that. That's crazy, you know. And I've that was my first thought when I heard it. It's like, well, why do you call it that? And it turns out there's not really a good reason to call it that, you know, because A, we're not inducing anything, and B, what we're focusing on, what we do as therapists is channel people into their core sadness. That's the whole meat of the process, you know.
Yeah.
Most of the time people get lost thinking about, oh, what's going to happen to me now, or I'm so angry at this doctor or that, you know, family person, or I'm so guilty that I didn't see this coming. And those are all deflections from what's really and this is Botkin's, you know, Nobel Prize winning discovery, was that you can take care of guilt and anger by not doing anything with them. that you just refocus people on the core sadness, and that drains all of the juice away from those other emotions. You don't have to deal with them at all. And, so I wanted, if it was up to me, I would call it, core sadness focused therapy, or something like that. That, and the other good reason is that, when Botkin was doing this at the VA, he didn't say that it was anything other than, this is your therapy session with the VA. And 100% of the people that he treated had this after-death communication experience. And when he took it publicly, it went down to 75. Now, what's the difference? Expectation. Yeah. People have this idea that I'm going to see this person, or I'm going to hear this person, or I'm going to feel this person, and I'm looking in this direction, and I'm not seeing what's over here.
Yes, because you're looking.
I'm not noticing this. I've already discounted that. That's a big problem. That's part of the whole spade work of trying to get somebody to there, is trying to get them to quit doing that. Stop that. And sometimes you can't. It's like telling people, don't think of a pink elephant or something.
Yeah. So he found that when people went into the therapy expecting to have these communications, that's when they didn't seem to have them.
Not as often. They really don't. Because as there's some place in Botkin's book where he talks about having a session with a fellow who he thought had a particularly good connection with his deceased brother. And he said, do you mind if I ask him a question? And the client said, sure. And he said, well, ask him what he thinks about IADC. And they did another set, and client says, well, my brother says he thinks it's fine. Just remember, we're in charge of it, not you.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're not doing anything except getting people to a place we know they can be receptive to what's already there. My analogy is, Starlight is very real, and it's all over the place. But if you try to look at it during the daytime, you're not going to see much, because there's this big hot incandescent ball of flaming gas in the sky that's kind of glaring and keeps everything So our job is to kind of let the sun set, and then you get to see what's actually already there.
Yeah.
We're not producing anything.
It's a good analogy. So if IADC is so successful as you say, even 70% is an exceptional success rate of having these experiences. Yeah. And then I imagine those that do have the experience, the percentage is just as high for those that find it beneficial. If that's the case, and you can show these figures, why do you think it's not accepted generally as a true practice?
Well, it's, first of all, it's been a logistics problem, because up until 2011, Botkin was doing this pretty much alone. I mean, he trained a lot of people. He trained several hundred therapists from not just in the U.S., but in Germany and other places, some from South America. I came on board as the clinical director in 2011. And I think I was the first board member for IADC. We now have 6, I believe, one in Italy, one in Germany, a couple in France, a couple more in the United States. But it was kind of a mom and pop organization. We were doing something without a lot of help and without a lot of organization. We've gotten the number of therapists worldwide now up to about 500 or 600. And Dr. Botkin actually just retired in August. His Health was not the best, is not the best. And he's retired from practice even. He's not doing any more sessions. So we're hopeful going forward that, we're going to have a better organization for this. We already have completed one university-sponsored study comparing IADC outcomes with traditional supportive grief therapy, which came out very, very substantially in favor of the IADC method. But that's the only real research that's been done. And so there's going to have to be a lot more of that. EMDR had a lot of problems with it too. They finally, I think, overpowered it, overpowered the objections to it by just the sheer number of scientific studies that are attributed to EMDR now. But of course, we have to kind of do the disclaimer that says we're not part of that research because we don't use the entire protocol. So we have to kind of do this ourselves.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, actually. Going off track slightly, when you mention about scientific studies of therapy to show that they work, it confuses me because on one hand, people will say that anecdotal data is not scientific in any way, and yet when we do studies based on therapy or on pharmaceutical effects, the studies are, I'd imagine, always must by necessity be based off of testimony of those that undergo tests with it.
Yeah.
So they use scientific questionnaires, as Bruce Grayson has done with near-death experiences, and Jeffrey Long as well. And the deciding principle as to whether a therapy or a drug is effective or not is the testimony of those that take them.
Yeah.
So why is that anecdotal, if you call it anecdotal data, reasonable?
That's right.
And yet, you see what I mean?
Yes, exactly.
It seems contradictory.
We're using subjective description to try to define something as objective.
Yeah.
Which is...
A lot of people take EMDR and have said exactly the same things, that they've benefited from it. A lot of people have taken the COVID test, or the COVID vaccination tests trials, and they've all come out saying effectively the same things, which is why they've now got this list of whatever side effects or possible adverse effects. And it's the same with any vaccination. The only reason we know what the flu what side effects that can cause is because a lot of people have tested it and they've said the same thing. Near-death experiences, in their up to 1 billion people, have all said the same thing, and yet it's not taken seriously.
Yeah.
I don't understand the argument, but
I don't either. But there is a real bias. I was talking to actually this classmate I went to high school with. I was talking with him online, and I didn't quite understand where he was coming from originally, but he was railing against treating children for attention deficit disorder with any kind of medication. And he said, well, how do you even know they had it? Where are the blood tests that prove they have attention deficit disorder? I said, there isn't one. They don't have a dipstick that says, oh, you're low on attention. You treat somebody based on their behavior, based on this constellation of behaviors.
Exactly.
There's no empirical way of doing that, which he said was proof that this is all a sham.
Yes.
Turns out he was a Scientologist, which is explaining a lot. But
but I mean, even with something as common as anxiety, which I've been suffering with for 12 years, the test for anxiety, whether you've got generalized anxiety disorder, isn't that they stick a syringe in your head and test the serotonin levels in your synapses. It's based on what you communicate to people, what you communicate to your doctors.
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
a lot more times than not, it's diagnosed correctly and treated as such, based off of
Exactly.
anecdotal data.
Yeah. I mean, the whole DSM, movement that actually, I think we were on DSM-3 when I first got into the business, and now we're at 5, which
Can you remind me what that is, DSM?
the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological.
Right.
I forget the rest of it, but it's this whole index of numbers that correspond to particular diagnoses of mental disorders, including addictions and things like that. But those don't exist anywhere per se. You don't have an anxiety disorder. You have a constellation of feelings and behaviors that coalesce around something that we've identified in other people as kind of similar. That you have human being traits like these human beings have traits.
Yeah.
And we call it this.
Exactly. It's all under one label, although the experience is going to be different for everybody because everybody's their own person.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have if you cut your arm off, you're going to have the same exact sense of pain, unless there's a problem with your nerves or something like that. And that's the problem with mental conditions. Is there a problem of the mind? And if you open up someone's brain, you won't find anxiety, or you won't find depression. You might find traces of it in the level of serotonin, for example, but there's no real damage that's causing that physically.
Right.
And people will say there is a chemical imbalance that causes it, and if you were to balance those chemicals, which is why SSRIs work. But a question I would have is that treating the issue, or is that numbing it?
Mm-hmm.
And how would you know? Until the hard problem of consciousness is answered, how would you know?
I saw my grandmother when I was young, back in the 50s, that she suffered from kind of intractable depression. And really the only thing they had to offer at that time was electroconvulsive therapy.
Yeah.
And I saw her lose her affect, to the point where, I could have walked in and said, Nana, I've been elected king of the world, and she would probably have said, well, that's nice, And I am very grateful that we've, progressed in treatment since then, but it's certainly not without a host of like antidepressant medications. I see that as certainly not a long-term solution for anybody. It's kind of like, when you lose serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, stuff like that, your body's not going to work. It's kind of like running out of gas on the freeway somewhere. It's just not going anywhere. And lifestyle and metabolism are really the only way that's going to be replenished. But while you're trying to replenish that, you actually need something to run on. You need, it's kind of like, I'm going to put gas in the car, but before that gas gets from the tank to the engine, I'm going to be sitting there a while. I need to squirt some in the fuel injector or something.
Yeah. I don't know if that analogy would work exactly, because the SSRIs and these other drugs dealing with dopamine, they don't give extra serotonin. They just prevent. They help the body retain a certain amount of it that it naturally produces. So it's giving the body the way of maintaining the fuel, I suppose, making it more efficient.
It's kind of a short-term fix, basically.
Yeah. And it doesn't deal with the problem itself.
No, and they have a real history of, hey, we're working. Oh, we're not working anymore. Go find another one. The interesting thing to me right now is that they're finding so much efficacy with things like psilocybin,
Yeah.
and you know, they're doing. And what they're saying is that it's kind of like going in and rewiring the whole place, kind of at once, instead of trying to help it just kind of improve. I remember we had to give one of our cats, what is that drug? But they've used it now for, it was basically an animal, they were using it for animal tranquilizing, but it's kind of a psychedelic. And he had eaten a bunch of Christmas ribbon, and we had to have it fished out of his stomach.
Yeah.
And so they gave him some of that. And I've never seen a cat look so startled as when he came back home. He was like, oh my God, what the hell was that?
Just came back from a trip.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to see what he was like when he was high.
But that's being experimented with.
Yeah.
Also.
And it's also interesting, psychedelic trips, which I've never had one. I don't like the idea of anything messing with my consciousness. I don't even like the idea of going under anesthesia. But it's interesting that people have this reported state of heightened consciousness under the influence of psilocybin or DMT, and yet from neuroimaging techniques like fMRI and what have you, these substances don't make brain activity sporadic or more active. It decreases brain activity, which to me suggests that what it's doing is lowering the filtering mechanism of the brain and giving us access more to consciousness as it is. I mean, that's what it would suggest to me, maybe from my biases, which I don't deny that they're there, but that's one way of interpreting it. And it's just interesting that you have a richer experience with less brain activity.
That really makes sense, Darren. I mean, we know from, just like you said, the fMRIs and things, that when Buddhist meditators or Catholic nuns who are in contemplative orders and things like that, what you notice right away is that this piece of your brain, I think it's the anterior, I'm not going to get it, but it's the part of your brain that locates you in space. It's the part that
temporal parietal junction, or the temporal parietal.
Temporal parietal, okay.
Temporal parietal lobe, I think.
But it's the part that lets you reach out for a coffee cup and actually snag it instead of going, oh, it's not there, it's not there.
Yeah.
It locates you in the environment. That turns off, and people say, I feel oceanic, or I feel at one, and certain people say, well, that's a brain dysfunction. No, maybe that's the way it's supposed to function. And
exactly,
in order to,
the question is the disorder of that particular thing causing that illusion, or is it turning off its filtration system and letting you see what life really is?
Yeah.
And that's similar with evidence that's used for to prove that the brain creates consciousness. It can be taken in two ways, just as equally reasonably. But most people would say that that feeling of oneness is caused because your brain's not working and it's creating this illusion. But they don't consider the other fact or the other possibility that maybe it's because we know it's turning off. Maybe it's just showing us what really is there before the brain interferes.
And the other part of that is that when you reach a certain level of development and, I will say, enlightenment, what you're reaching for is that state of being connected. What really dawned on me many, many years ago was that almost any discomfort, pain, cruelty, you name it, was caused by somebody feeling that I'm alone inside this body and nothing else can reach me and nothing else matters except me.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Yeah.
Aloneness is basically a curse, is basically what, you know, came to me. And what's the cure for that? Noticing that you're not, noticing that the connection is there and it's vital and it's part of you. It's who you are.
And not just noticing that you're not, but noticing that you never will be and never have been.
That's a real heavy burden. Yeah. But, you know, part of what I do every day is do some consulting work for basically Medicare psychiatric hospitalizations, retrospective reviews. And it is amazing how many of these folks come to that conclusion. I'm alone. Nobody's here to help me. Nobody. Yeah. And a lot of them are, it involves, I'll say, a fairly recent death of somebody who was very important to them, within a year, maybe two. But aloneness in the universe is just absolutely intolerable for most people.
And understandably so. We have evolved to be group people. We're supposed to be in groups.
Exactly. It's a hardwired thing. I mean, think about being a proto-human, 100,000, 200,000 years ago, running around the steppes of Africa, and you say, "Hey, I want to go live by myself."
Yeah.
Well, you were never heard from again.
No.
You were lunch, basically. And so the gene pool just, subtracted that little idea over and over again, because that's the only way we could survive was together. And so even if you're comfortable, being alone, there's a part of you that says, I'm not really safe. I'm not really okay. I need to be anxious because there's nobody around.
Yeah. And perhaps this is why these, advanced yogis and meditators are able to live alone in caves, because they
turn that off. Yeah.
They understand that they're not alone. That
they're not. Yeah.
But by their very nature, their individuality, their a philosopher friend of mine would call it a dissociation of consciousness, but this individual may be alone, but ultimately our true nature, we're never alone. So that doesn't cause a problem to someone who's enlightened to that level.
Yes, when you've gotten to that point where you realize that it's funny when you watch little children and they're learning object constancy. I remember my son, who's of course now 44, but when he was old enough to walk and he'd go play in his room, he'd come toddling back out in about 20 minutes and go, "Oh, you're here again. That's so great." Wonderful, but over time, he begins to understand that we're still there even when he doesn't see us.
Yeah.
And peekaboo is not an enjoyable pastime for him anymore.
No.
It's like, oh yeah, here you are again, great. But that's kind of what we're up against. We are kind of tasked with developing the situation of recognizing our non-aloneness, even when it is pretty evident to us.
And I think, as I'm sure you've probably come to believe as well in your line of work, is that that's one thing we can say for many mental struggles like anxiety, like depression and various other things, is it pushes the person into that area of interest. I mean, I would have never have looked at life after death or anything like this if I didn't have anxiety disorder, because I would never have had the necessity to. I'd still be atheistic. I'd still believe that once you die, you die. And I'd still believe that all this spiritual stuff is nonsense, because I never had, and many people never have the opportunity or the motivation to really look at it. So in that way, you know, that's...
I think that's a kind of a cultural ditch that we're in. You know, for most people, looking at that is kind of like a fire hose on the wall that says, you know, in case of emergency, break glass. But you know, otherwise, just leave it the hell alone. You know, just
let it do
don't even just keep doing what you're doing. You know, be distracted, be busy, be addicted, be you know, obsessed. Do something other than that. You know.
Yeah. So do you think if IADC techniques were brought into the more mainstream area of counselling, do you think that would be of huge benefit to the population as a whole?
I would wish that. I would wish that for society that you know, having the experience of not being separated, not being you know, the part of your brain that registers when you drop a hammer on your toe is the same one that registers when you feel socially excluded, when you feel rejected, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
But I think it also, you know, says when you look around and say, how much of society feels excluded? How much of it feels, you know, nobody cares?
Yeah.
And then you add on top of that, this person who I thought was my connection to caring in the world has died. You know, now I'm just totally bereft. I don't have any place to belong. I don't have, you know, I don't see that this could do anything but help not just individuals, but the connection between individuals, which, you know, we call culture. You know, it's really interesting now in COVID times when we, you know, in America now we've lost 325,000 people in 1 year, in less than a year.
That's a lot, isn't it?
The last time this happened, we lost over 400,000, I think, in 1918.
Spanish flu.
And there were some real changes that happened as a result of that. You know, up until 1918, people used to have, you know, wakes in their parlor. They would lay out, you know, their loved one in the parlor, and there were so many people that died, of even bigger percent of the population than today. Everything changed, and they started having funeral parlors. You know, we're going to have we don't have enough room in our house for all the people that died, so we're going to, you know, ship this out. And that and there was so much death associated with parlors that when that was over, they renamed the whole that whole part of the house. It was no longer a parlor, it became a living room.
Yes.
We don't want to associate with that anymore. So I'm really interested to see what will come out of this time.
Yes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast. If you did and would like to continue following my research, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and following the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. You can also join our Facebook discussion group. You can find the link to this and other Seeking Eye online profiles at seeking-eye.com. Thank you.